Слава Україні!
Hello everyone, my name is Paul. Welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic night. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. There's a ton of stuff that is happening in the news, of course, as there is every single night. A lot of it, generally speaking, is not what we would consider to be good things. Generally speaking, the stuff that ends up making the news is rather depressing. And a lot of it has to do with war and conflicts, a lot of human suffering throughout the entirety of the planet. But luckily here at the New News, you guys allow us to be the news that gives back. And the way that you were able to actually go through and we're able to do that is by going with you guys and going through you guys. So if you guys go into the video description below, you're going to see a ton of different organizational links. This is the reason why we're never monetizing this channel for personal gain. We're never doing any kind of super chats or merchandising or anything else. We are always going to be 100% charity driven. And in the description, there are a ton of different charities, many of which were submitted by you guys as viewers. And if you check them out, 70% or more of the donations that they receive go directly to their programs, so 30% or less, with the emphasis on or less, going to things such as salaries, administration's costs, stuff that usually makes a lot of organizations kind of controversial. Which is why you may see many credible, very well-known organizations that may not pop up inside of our list there. So if you have more, please keep them coming. We have, of course, our website in the description. You can get in contact with the staff member on our official emails there, or you can go onto our Discord community, also linked in the description, and go and check out our Discord community where a lot of stuff gets posted, a lot of chats happen there. But you can get in contact with the staff member on that community. Give us a link as well as a short description of the organization, what they do, so we can start our vetting process and hopefully get them added onto the stream. We want to cover every single inch of the globe that we possibly can, and we want to help as many people as possible. We have really high hopes and really big goals for 2023, and we'd love if you would join us and help us in that. And if you can't give a lot to these organizations, give a little. If you can't give a lot, or if you can't give anything at all, that's fine too. I definitely feel you there. But one of the things you can do is help us grow this community. The more people that come here, the more people that watch this and become informed on what's happening in the world around them, the more good we'll be able to do, the more of an impact this community will have. So help me and help this channel and this wonderful team that we have here try and do as much good as possible. So that like and subscribe, that those comments, those sharing it amongst the community as you guys have been, helps tremendously. As we get ready to move into the actual news here, a lot of it has to do with conflicts, counterterrorism operations, the war in Ukraine, a lot of stuff ongoing throughout the globe. And I please implore you to ask questions if you are joining us live tonight. I am watching the live chat as I am every single night. And as questions and comments come through, I will answer them to the very best of my ability using my background and knowledge that I have obtained over the years. To try and answer those, with some kind of clarity and try and make this stuff understandable for the average person. So please feel free to ask questions. To give you a little bit of a background on myself, I served in the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020. I was an 0352 anti-tank missileman, as well as a corporal in 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. I did 2 tours to the Middle East. My first tour was in between October of 2017 and March of 2018, and during that tour I spent 4.5 months in the country of Syria, where I was supporting Operation Inherent Resolve and the Special Operations Forces and coalition partners, as well as the SDF, fighting the Islamic State inside of Syria, as well as going through there and as stabilizing the area, especially against Russian and pro-Assad forces. My second tour to the Middle East, I went between October of 2019 and March of 2020. I was there as the Javelin team leader for Crisis Response Company out of Kuwait, meaning I oversaw all anti-armor operations for the Crisis Response Company. And from there, I actually deployed as one of the 100 Marines that went to the Baghdad embassy compound on New Year's of 2020 and was there for the protests that happened and was part of the efforts to put those down and to ensure the stability of the embassy. I oversaw all anti-armor operations over the entire U.S. Baghdad embassy complex, as well as afterwards I went to Saudi Arabia, where I trained Saudi Arabian Marines who were getting ready to deploy to Yemen and going to fight the Houthi rebels there, which are backed by Iran. So I am a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine. I am also a fully cross-trained machine gunner, a fully cross-trained rifleman, a partially cross-trained radio operator, and a CLS or Combat Life Saver certified Marine. I have received additional medical training on top of what most Marines will receive. And I do have experience and application in the field using that on real casualties during my time in Syria. So on top of that, I have other interests that I will not claim to be a subject matter expert in, including history, human geography, geopolitics, and a wide spectrum of other things. Please feel free to ask those questions, but subject matter expert or not really doesn't matter, because I implore you as the viewer, if you have something that you find interesting, please do your own research. There is no substitute for this. There's no substitute for anything. No person on the internet will be able to tell you it all. Please do your own research. If anything is of interest for you, it is imperative for your own knowledge sake. And when you're doing this kind of stuff, if you would like a starting point, we do provide our map on our websites. All of our maps since April have been archived when we started to archive them. And you can go through and you can click on any of the links, anything on this map, and go through and start if you would like a starting point for your research. This is all available and is all published prior to the stream. So with that, we get ready to move directly into the news here. Of course, we jump down here and into the war in Ukraine. And there is a ton of stuff happening inside the country. And we start off with some good news here. And the good news is that there was another successful prisoner exchange. This is the 36th one since the beginning of the war, which is fantastic. Another 50 Ukrainians were actually returned home after spending months as a Russian POW, after being subjected to most likely what is expected to be torture, ill treatment, and pretty terrible living conditions. The returning individuals are going to be undergo a medical treatment and the observation period for being officially released back home to their families. So they will get to see their families during that time. And in return, Russia did receive 50 prisoners of war in exchange. So it was a 1-for-1 swap, which we saw reported on Russian official state-run news channels. We can see this getting reported here on the official General Staff of Ukraine's Twitter here. Nice group photo of everybody as they came back. You see the ambulance is already ready to go there in the background. That same photo being posted. This is coming from the Verkhovna Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament as well. And you see those guys coming back.
Як роса на сонці, запануєм і ми, браття, у своїй сторонці. Душу й тіло ми положим за нашу покажем, що ми браття козацького роду. Душу й тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Слава, слава, слава!
Ура! Ура! Ура!
So obviously those guys are pretty excited to be back. And with that, we actually had a question come in from Buckham 40 who asked, how excited or how happy are Russian POWs getting exchanged? Well, it's a very different tenor when you look at Russian POWs. There was actually video footage of them actually getting off of the aircraft and coming from RT, which is the Russian-owned. It used to be called Russia Today, or Russia Today. RT is the Russian state-run media news network. They also own things like RIA Novosti, and Ruptly, and Sputnik, being the major three networks that they do own. But they actually had video footage of them getting off of the aircraft, and it's definitely a different tenor. It's definitely a much more somber one for the Russians. I don't know if there necessarily isn't any excitement, but there isn't a whole lot of emotion that comes out of it. These guys seem pretty dead behind the eyes. They don't really want to talk to reporters. They don't really want to say anything. They don't want to talk about anything. Whether that's under the instruction that they were given or what have you, there's just a very different, it's not a very much of a joyous tone, even though these guys are landing back supposedly inside of Russia on board an aircraft, and they're returning home. And I think that there is probably a good likelihood that they're expecting to actually end up being recalled and going back up to the front once they spend a little bit of time back inside of Russia, and possibly even undergo interrogations there themselves, asking what information did they ask for, what did you tell them, that kind of stuff. So we don't know. There's a lot of speculation on what happens, but the reality is that it does not seem to be nearly as a joyous occasion. Not a lot of fanfare, not a lot of talk. The aircraft landed at nighttime. There's a whole 3 people on the whole tarmac. There wasn't really anything there ongoing. There wasn't any trucks waiting for them, no ambulances. They are literally carrying their packs off of the bird, like you had just gotten into, say, the Middle East or something. It was very, very different. Barbara Christina says the Wagner prisoner who gave himself up was sent back to Russians, and he was executed by sledgehammer a short while ago. Yes, that is true. We do know that happened, and that's actually something Yevgeny Prigozhin actually sent the European Union. They actually sent them a sledgehammer with the Wagner insignia that had fake blood all over it. In regards to that video, that is something that did happen. The Wagner group but it is not the Russian military. It is a private military corporation that is extensively used by the Russian military itself as a means of plausible deniability for really the motives of the Russian forces. So the Russians have plausible deniability with the Wagner group. And we saw this back when I was in Syria. The Wagner group attacked my sister platoon, Cat 2, down in the Conoco gas plant, which was during the Battle of Kashan, February the 7th of 2018. My sister platoon, Cat 2, was engaged by about 300 of them, as well as armored vehicles and pro-Assad militants that were with them, and they were bombed. And before that bombing could commence, before we could actually call in the airstrikes to hit them, what had to be done is there was a hotline between American and our coalition and Russian forces. And we said, do you have any forces north of the Euphrates River? To which the official Russian military responded, no, we have nobody north of the Euphrates River. And then we went through and we said, okay, cool, they are cleared hot. These are not standard Russian military forces. And the aircraft were cleared hot and began to engage, which lasted about 3.5 hours. The Russian forces literally used them. We have it pretty well set that this was at the direction of the Russian Federation, but it's not something that can be proved. It's something that the Russian Federation, these guys, they got caught, they were unable to succeed in their mission, and therefore the Russians let them plausible deniability. Not our guys, not our problem. You can do whatever. And now, all of a sudden, they don't have to report any official military losses inside of Syria. Likewise, any criminal activity that may be ongoing in areas such as Bakhmut, where the majority of Russian forces are comprised of the Wagner group, as well as atrocities committed there, a lot of stuff may end up being pushed later on onto, well, those were contractors. Those weren't the Russian military themselves. Should things go south for the Russians and in the publicity inside of Russia, should they lose that propaganda grip, they could be used as kind of the scapegoat for Russian troops. Our Russian troops did what they were supposed to. It was the Wagner group. So Yevgeny Prigozhin can still get thrown underneath the bus. And we've seen that kind of stuff happen before. So definitely a thing. But yes, they do that. They Wagner Group does look at things as a very Stalinistic style of no step backwards, meaning you cannot surrender, you cannot surrender, you cannot retreat, etc. And they are basically conducting wave style attacks. These guys that are being brought out of the prisons into the Wagner Group with the serve a 6 months contract, your criminal record, regardless of what it is wiped clean. And these guys are literally being handed a map with an overlay, a Google map with an overlay of the battlefield situation, and going, all right, go attack. This is how you're going to move. Like, this is literally with an arrow on the map. This is how you're going to move. All right, go and attack this trench line, and they just get mowed down. And they retreat. Sometimes they're actually shot by the, can call them commissars, by the Wagner commissars, and the other ones that surrender. If they are exchanged back, since they have surrendered, they are sent back to the Wagner Group, and they are executed by the Wagner Group. There is no surrender. There is no retreat. It's a no-step-back doctrine. Moving on here, we can see a pretty incredible thing, and this is, we could not quite specify exactly where this is at. We put it in Kyiv just because of the higher echelon of care, because this really shows something important. I've talked about this before. When you have a battlefield casualty, you have a window called the golden hour, and the golden hour is 1 hour after the incident which causes the injury, is when you need to evacuate someone to a higher echelon of care. Not just the battlefield care that myself or a corpsman or a medic or what have you can provide you on the X or on the point in which you become injured, but actually evacuating someone to a field hospital, which they get brought back to. For us, it would have been like Ramstein Air Base, where if we had a casualty, they were flown back to Germany, and they actually got a really high level of medical care there. And that's where a lot of casualties from Afghanistan and Iraq went as well. And the reason why this golden hour is so important is because after the golden hour, your likelihood of survivability, saying your priority casualty, actually drops by 80%. This is a perfect example of a golden hour. This is the perfect example of someone who has met that criteria. This is someone who has been saved because of those kinds of fast-paced medical evacuation mentality and good, pretty amazing treatment on everyone's part. Everyone from the guy who helped him put bandages on, to the medic who is saving him, to the guys who are transporting him on the ground, to the pilots that probably flew him back if there were any. And that's because this is a Ukrainian serviceman, and he did live. This is a Ukrainian serviceman who was hit with a direct impact of a VOG-21 high explosive grenade round. It's similar to the M203 40mm grenades used by NATO forces. That goes into underbarrel grenade launchers. That it's essentially the same thing, but for the Russians. And this VOG-21 round direct impacted him in the abdomen. It went into, it looks like, the side of the abdomen, but it did not detonate, meaning it did not explode. And a surgical team was able to successfully remove that grenade from him with the help of both a very skilled surgical team and an EOD team that was there working with them to ensure that it remained safe, because that grenade is still armed and it is still live, and they were able to properly dispose of it. Coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, you can see the first photo here is that VOG-21 grenade, and you can see it's lodged in his abdomen. This is actually an area, this is where your lungs are actually at, and you can see kind of the outlines of the lungs here. So this is actually pushing on his internal organs. Okay, this is in, I believe it would be considered not the second, the ventricle space, the ventricle cavity, and if I am remembering this correctly. And so it's putting pressure on his internal organs, making it difficult to breathe, on top of probably a wide spectrum of other issues, such as the entrance wound is probably pretty large. I'm going to guess and say he probably had tension pneumothorax and tension hemothorax, which is bleeding and air getting into that space, which is putting additional pressure onto that. So pretty significant very significant damage, very significant casualty. This is not something that you would think someone would be able to survive. Most certainly he can. He did. They did actually, and you can see it there in the surgeon's hand, they did actually extract the grenade. They did remove the grenade from inside of him. So he is alive. They were able to actually do that. This looks more like a battlefield hospital, but it is a pretty amazing thing. And that is the reason why that golden hour is so important. Why getting someone to a higher echelon of care is so important, because of injuries like that. You would think he definitely, if he wasn't immediately evacuated, this definitely, with all of the issues that could have possibly arisen from that, and that's just naming a couple off the top of my head, those easily could have killed him very quickly too. It's amazing that he's alive. It's very lucky that it didn't detonate when it impacted him, let alone that he's able to survive that, the surgery, and everything else. So I'm sure he's in very critical condition, but it's a pretty amazing, it's a testament to just how far battlefield medicine has come, because it has come quite an extensively long way over the several decades. I mean, just looking at Vietnam casualty rates versus now is pretty impressive when you look at survivability. So very important. I think it's a really great thing to emphasize and to show just the skill also. The medical staff for the Ukrainian armed forces especially really do not get a lot of credit. They're not nearly as enough credit as they deserve. They are saving immense amount of lives from both sides, civilians, military personnel, Russian, Ukrainian. It's quite an amazing feat, and they're doing some amazing work in some rather not so great conditions. So to put it very lightly, I think is the understatement of a century. Battlefield surgical teams are absolutely amazing, some of the best, and they definitely continue to prove it. Cleanup continues as we move over here into the Kharkiv Oblast, and that's because the heavy usage of explosive ordnance by both sides throughout this war has had a lasting impact, a very long-lasting impact on Ukraine, and will affect the country for decades, if not well over a century, as we've seen with the unexploded ordnance from World War I and World War II. So what we see here is very small teams of EOD personnel, explosive ordnance disposal personnel. They're going out and they are collecting just tons of unexploded ordnance every single day. Here in the Kharkiv Oblast alone, they found hand grenades, landmines, and stuff that were just laying on the side of the road. And this doesn't include the munitions which have been buried by the mud and the planting season and everything else since the heavy fighting was taking place here in the Kharkiv Oblast earlier last year. So it's quite an immense amount, and you cannot underestimate just how much explosive ordnance. We're talking about hundreds, if not well over 1,000 pieces of unexploded ordnance covered in like a quarter of a square mile. Which comes out to about just roughly under a quarter of a square kilometer, and over 1,000 pieces of ordnance found in just that small area surveyed. The immense amount of destructive power that has been thrown throughout this war is something that is in a scale that is almost incomprehensible to the human mind. There's almost no way to quantify it. Just the insanity that has happened because of this war. And we can see these kinds of things here. So these are anti-tank mines that they have pulled. They already have the detonators at the top of them. They have red detonators that once they reach a certain threshold of weight on top of them, that detonates the mine. You can also see the hand grenades there as well. Rendered safe, they actually have the fuse caps out on the top of them. So, but this is just laying on the side of the road and has been for months. And this stuff is everywhere. That doesn't include the stuff that was purposely rigged for booby trap once again, or stuff that has embedded itself into the mud, or what have you. There's just a ton of stuff laying everywhere. And we can actually see that update coming from the Ministry of Internal Affairs where they're talking about this. They're saying here that so far since the beginning of the war, they have neutralized 313,113 general purpose munitions and 2,891 kilograms of explosives, which also includes 2,157 aerial bombs. The territory is about 77,061 hectares surveyed. So that comes out to, what is that, 600? Uh-oh. Okay. Are we good now? I started seeing a bunch of stuff popping up that I was lagging. I think we may be good now. Sorry, there's like a 30-second delay in this stuff. All right, sweet. So I'm going to start that again. So Barbara Christina ended up asking, apparently in Europe, World War I explosives are found every year by farmers. Surely laying mines like this is a war crime. And the answer is yes and no. So when it comes to unexploded ordnance inside of Europe, places like in Belgium and Flanders, such as over by Ypres and over by Passchendaele Ridge and stuff like that, which I'll get to a little bit later because I have a whole thing on it in here. And as well as when you're looking at places like the Ardennes Forest, where it's actually too dangerous in parts of the Ardennes Forest in France for people to even go to. And even the EOD guys, it's too dangerous. They said it's just completely off limits to everybody, even explosive experts. It's not worth it. And every single year when farmers are plowing the fields in the spring, they have what's called the steel harvest. And the steel harvest is they are pulling up all of these old explosives. And it's so common that French farmers, and Belgian farmers are literally picking up these 100-year-old hand grenades, completely volatile, and they just stack them on the side of the road like rocks when they are plowing fields here in the United States, or maybe in the United Kingdom for you. And they are then collected by EOD personnel who drive around in vans every single spring. And they just pick up all of these hand grenades that are found in mortars and shells on the side of the road, and they put them in the back of these vans. They put them in these, explosive boxes, and then they go out and they detonate them in the middle of a field somewhere. So it's a thing. I mean, they do that every single year. It's crazy to think about. 100 years later, well over 100 years later. I think the end of World War I was 1918, or was fought between 1914 and 1918. So 4 years of millions of shells in single engagement. There's like 1 million shells fired in the very first day of the Somme alone. So quite an immense amount. And when it comes to the usage of landmines are a war crime if you are party to the Ottawa Convention. And neither Ukraine nor Russia is party to the Ottawa Convention. So the Ottawa Convention limits certain things. So it doesn't limit landmines per se. It limits victim-initiated or self-initiated triggering landmines. These are landmines, anti-personnel mines, which are, their main purpose is when they are triggered by the victim. Victim-triggered IEDs are exactly the same thing. Victim-initiated. So what you do is you step on the landmine and then you step off and it goes off. Or you step on the landmine and it goes off, kills or maims or horrifically injures you and the people around you. The Ottawa Convention does not prohibit anti-personnel mines such as the Claymore mine, which is triggered by the individual observing the victim. So, which is how the United States kind of gets around the Ottawa Convention. The Ottawa Convention also does not limit cluster munitions, or the Ottawa Convention also limits cluster munitions, which we do know that both Ukraine and Russia have at its disposal, with Russia using it significantly. The things that keep these in line and how you can still cover these, even though even though neither party is in the Ottawa Conventions, is through the usage of indiscriminate attacks, which actually falls under Additional Protocol 1, which was adopted in 1977 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. So the 1949 Geneva Conventions and this additional protocol say that your attacks and how you conduct your military operations the planning that goes into it must be to minimize possible civilian casualties and the impact on civilian populations. Failure to do so is a war crime. And how we see the massive amounts of landmine usage can be considered indiscriminate. Booby trapping homes in places like Bucha and Irpin, as we saw with the withdrawal Russian forces there, also indiscriminate. People coming back, also coming back to places inside of Ukraine, trying to come back to their homes in Bucha after everything is done, aren't going through, and they're not really getting, they're have a possibility of setting off a booby trap inside of their homes. So that's just kind of what we're seeing there, and kind of what we're looking at when it comes to this kind of stuff. Now, an interesting conversation, or an interesting thing that popped up in my news chat, is coming from Don Juan De Marco, who says, why do you refuse to talk with pro-Russian U.S. veterans? Are you scared of the truth? So, no, I don't have a problem talking with pro-Russian sources. In fact, I have a wide variety of pro-Russian sources, a very wide variety of them, and I will actually go through when we get to the international news segment and show you quite a few of them. A lot of them being things like RT, Sputnik, which are actually the same thing. RIA Novosti, which is actually also the same thing. I actually go to the Kremlin website. I go and I look at everything. So I'm not here to give misinformation, is the thing. And unlike a lot of veterans, I have real experience dealing with the Russian military on a personal level, with my time in Syria, dealing with them, how their ROEs were, and on a very personal level, also dealing with the casualties, 90% of which were civilian casualties, as a result of a lot of Russian indiscriminate artillery bombardments. The difference is most people, especially veterans who may be pro-Russian, probably dealt with the Soviet Union in the 80s and the immediate collapse after the 90s, whereas I drove through entire villages that were flattened by the Russian Federation in their aerial bombing campaigns. So that is why I don't particularly speak to a lot of sources, because I can attest firsthand what happens. So I hope that answers your question. And speaking of these types of bombardment campaigns, we actually come over here and we look at the city of Shevakove, which is over here in the Kharkiv Oblast, where unfortunately a very horrific missile strike ended up taking place. The Russian missile strike actually had a direct hit on side of a Ukrainian market here in Shevakove. And initial reports right now are the result is 2 people having been killed, 6 having been injured, with initial reports saying 7, including an injured 10-year-old girl initially reported to have been 13. The missile made a direct impact, like I said, on the city's local market, resulting in significant civilian casualties. The work is still currently ongoing, and they're still sifting through the rubble. People quite literally being buried. It's absolutely horrific. Quote, this is coming from Ole Subanov, the head of the Kharkiv Regional Military Administration, who said, quote, Russian aggressors fired missiles at a local market in the settlement of Shevchenkove in the Kharkiv region on January 9th. 2 people were killed, 6 citizens were injured, including a 10-year-old child. And we can see that initial report coming from Amin Dezepor, who is the first deputy minister of the Foreign Affairs. In a short video of this here. Like I said, this is the initial report where 7 were injured and 13 were, including a 13-year-old girl. The updated information comes from much later in the day, coming from the military administration there. You can see that direct impact and just how massive a crater it is. These are likely probably an S300 batteries, relatively ineffective as a ground-to-ground weapon. Due to a lack of Russian special purpose munitions being used. So due to a lack of munitions being used, like special purpose munitions, precision munitions, which precision munitions inside of Russia is not particularly precision, they have actually run out of these long range systems, and therefore, as a result, are converting S-300 missiles to hit ground targets, even though they're originally designed to hit air targets. They're a SAM, or surface to air missile system. You can see here, quite literally, people being buried. You can see the arm sticking out there. People being buried alive inside of the rubble. And coming from the Verkhovna Rada, there is the continuation of that photo of where they're trying to rescue this woman. Literally having to unbury her. And see, war crimes prosecutors are already on scene. But absolutely horrific. Likewise, the horrificness does not stop as we move over here into the Luhansk Oblast. And today's update comes from, once again, from Serhiy Haida, who is the head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration. And according to his tweets, he stated that the last inhabitant of the village of Novoselivsky was killed due to a Russian sniper. So the last resident of the town was killed, or the last inhabitant of the town has been killed due to Russian sniper fire, according to him. While shelling ended up killing another 2 and injuring 2 more in the village of Nevsky. And we can see that coming here. Once again, large explosion coming from that, but that is an entire, that has now tallied, an entire village. Now, the last inhabitant of the village was killed, should these reports be true. Meanwhile, over here, this is in Zolotorivka, which is in the Luhansk Oblast, and we see here where we are starting to get some more information. Now, over the New Year's, over the kind of the New Year holiday and very early on into the New Year, there were several reports of very major strikes that occurred throughout occupied areas, targeting large gatherings of Russian military personnel that were there to celebrate the holiday. Basically, they all gathered in one location. One of those is reportedly coming from here. This is in Zolotorivka, where reportedly from the deadly strike occurring on or around the New Year holiday from mobilized personnel has finally, that footage has started to surface. So this is reportedly coming from Anatoly Shary, who is a pro-Russian journalist. This shows what is reported to be the same scene coming from a gathering of Russian mobilized forces. And then in the aftermath of the strike, it has been reported so far that in this strike, between 70 and 100 Russian troops were killed. However, there is no official confirmations regarding the death toll. So this is some stuff, once again, there's been a lot of chatter about it. We can't do any confirmations on it, but figured it was very important to address as we start getting more clarification on kind of what the situation was regarding that. So there wasn't a lot of explanation outside of there appears to have been a lot of strikes, a lot of Russian forces were killed, and that was pretty much it. So some clarification is always good, and hopefully this provides some of that.
Более-менее по-цивильному все. Как-то сок, койки одноярусные раскладушки. Ну, видно, Поехали, ребята! Сука, я фому долба. Что-то никого никто не выходит. Хоть дело все полегли там, 7 человек. Ну, блядь, сука. Да а что, слышишь? А что, прямо на них легло, да? Все, где?
На меня с двух сторон валилось. Он мужик там охуевался.
Нет, я говорю, второй этаж, такие вот на массе лежал.
Да.
Тоже, да?
Скорее всего, там, как хуям, не знаю.
This kind of gives you the general gist of kind of the striking potential out of that. And so what we end up seeing here is quite an extensive amount of damage that came as a result of that. So hopefully some more clarification pops up here in the near future. We'd like to be able to clarify that a little bit more. Kramatorsk was reportedly shelled by Russian forces once again, and this comes from, of course, Pavel Korolenko, and crew is currently stating that there are at least 2 dead. You can see some of the impacts there. Once again, large impact craters suggesting likely those S-300 missile strikes. And we, of course, get our daily Donetsk update. Once again, Pavel Korolenko, head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration, who said, quote, on January 8th, number of victims of a Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 2 killed and 2 injured. We do get that from his official graphic, released at 8 a.m. local time this morning, which showed at least 1 person have been killed in Bakhmut, while 2 were injured, as well as 1 person having been killed inside of Soledar. From the start of the Russians' official invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, so far, 1,295 civilians have been killed, with 2,833 having been injured. And this does not include areas such as Volnovaka, Donetsk, Mariupol, places currently under Russian occupation, where the death toll is going to be significantly higher. We do know that death toll actually climbs into the tens of thousands when it comes to Mariupol, considering the imagery that has been pointed out thanks to the Maxar satellite. Yashenivka was also shelled, with the artillery impacting the industrial parts of the city. Luckily, there were no reports of casualties, though heavy shelling did inflict casualties elsewhere, as we've already seen. So, luckily, nobody was killed and nobody was injured. But a lot of talk of Soledar over the past couple of days, and the information is not very clear. It appears to be a very fluid situation, so we will do our best to try and navigate what is true and what is not with this and make corrections as need be. But here in Soledar, which is along the northern flank of Bakhmut, and Russian forces are reported to have advanced further with Soledar. Russian forces reported to have advanced further there, while there is very little information coming out of Soledar. One thing has been very clear over about the past 48 hours, and that is that the situation on Bakhmut's northern flank is at a very critical point. Russian forces were able to push in clear up into where we have it marked now, the salt mine. As of yesterday and as of Saturday night's stream, we were stating that this area was to be considered contested. It is very possible Russian forces have pushed past this point, and we've seen very significant fighting out of Bakhmut. Once again, the information is not very clear. There are reports that Ukrainian troops are partially encircled. There has been talk that, especially from Russian forces, that they have actually pushed all the way over to Pidhorodne, which is down over here. This is actually where we saw Ukrainian forces actually returning to the rear from the lines, actually kind of moving back over into this general area as they were being relieved by other forces. We've heard all sorts of things, possibly a pincer maneuver by the Russian forces, all sorts. So it's not very clear. There's a lot of things that it's kind of up in the air from a lot of sources right now as to what exactly is happening. We are not changing the map until we have any definitive evidence that something in the ground situation has significantly changed that provides evidence for us to do so. But as of right now, Soledar is very heavily contested, and we do still see significant combat coming out of Soledar over the past 24 to 48 hours.
Солидар, хлопці.
This does have copyright music, but this is reportedly a Ukrainian tank engaging Russian forces around the salt mine complex. And as we can see here, this is actually some footage that came out as of yesterday. This is a Soledar, and so this is satellite imagery of Soledar and of Pidhidore there to the south. You can see the utter destruction of Soledar. There is snow on the ground as of yesterday, and you can see where the shelling is taking place. There's going to be a lot of fresh shelling that's going to be able to pop up here on the map because of that recent snowfall. You can see where the vast majority is taking place. And you can see an immense amount of shell fire landing right here, right in the center of Soledar. Lots of it here onto the flanks of Soledar out in these open fields. Same thing here, kind of to the north. You can see those bursts of shell fire having hit here and just kind of spread around. And this really kind of illustrates the point, just how indiscriminate I'm talking about. The MBM-21 Grad system and the artillery systems that are firing here, they're not being precision. They're not, doing one in the adjust and trying to, walk themselves and bracket onto a target. They are literally putting as much physical firepower into one general area as they can and just leveling entire, giant swaths of land. And you can see, where snow is collected in other craters too. It is being completely just pot-marked all over the place. You see shell craters there, shell craters there, shell craters there. So this means that this shelling has taken place since the snowfall. So quite significant amounts of shelling there. And that brings us into Bakhmut. And I was talking a little bit about Flanders and the battles of World War I. And I've compared this war quite a lot to World War I, the significant amounts of artillery usage. And the Bakhmut sector of the front line, which spans from Bilhorivka here to the north, 23 miles to the south over by Zaitsev, really this 23.1 miles of front line here is really the Flanders of the 21st century. That is what I'm starting to call this. This is what my perception of the battlefield is. And that is the Flanders of the 21st century. So the battles of Flanders, such as the Ypres salient inside of Belgium, saw some of the longest and bloodiest, most brutal battles of the First World War. They include the first and second battles of Passchendaele and the Passchendaele Ridge. They include the Battle of Bulimov, which saw the very first usage of poison gas, mustard gas, during the First World War. And the first and second battles of Ypres themselves, of itself. The Battle of Lys. And between 1914 and 1918, 4 years of continuous fighting over this small stretch of ground. Over 1 million troops from 50 separate countries would be killed, wounded, or missing in action. Bakhmut in this sector of the front line, similar to that northern sector of Flanders and the Western Front, is nothing but constant bombardment, brutal close quarters urban combat in the ruined streets of whatever villages have been wiped off and exist only in name, with wave attacks across muddy, cold, crater-filled no man's lands against heavily defended trench lines. It mirrors the horrific images of World War I to a degree that it is uncanny. We've seen this before 100 years ago. Once again, cities are so completely and utterly destroyed. They exist only in name. There is no village. There is no city left. Just like Ypres at the end of the war, there was no Ypres left. Photos of Ypres do exist from the First World War, and you cannot tell it from the rest of the fields around it because it has been pulverized by so much artillery. And in every sense of the word, this gets chalked up to a word and a term I have heard over and over and over again throughout the duration of this war. A meat grinder. It is, in every definition of the word, a meat grinder. 25,000 Ukrainian troops, as of the last numbers we heard, were up against roughly 30 to 35,000 Russian forces. Despite its inherent beauty and very peaceful rural life here around Bakhmut, it will forever go down in infamy for the brutal, savage fighting that is taking place there now. Coming from Serhiy Cherovaty, who is the spokesman for the Eastern Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, quote, in the Bakhmut direction, 43 combat clashes occurred in the last 24 hours. Russian terrorists shelled Ukrainian positions 281 times. At the same time, Ukrainian defenders killed 107 and wounded 123 Russian occupiers, end quote. Bookham 40 says, in World War I, what did they do to break this trench warfare? Tanks. Tanks, to an extent, did it. There's a lot of factors that go into that, though. And I think it might be worth probably reading more into that in a better way than I can describe it. But there's a lot of factors that go into that. To illustrate my point here, this is the crossroads. This is a crossroads just to the northeast of Bakhmut. So this photo, this satellite photograph, and you can already see a couple of shelf marks here, right? This photograph was taken in August. So this satellite photo was taken in August from Maxar satellite footage. You can already see some impacts from artillery. The battle actually starts about June the 4th is when we initially started reporting the first major contact around Bakhmut. This is following the Popasna Pocket. This is as the end of the Battle of Severodonetsk is wrapping up. And so this is about 2 months after the battle for Bakhmut really has started. And you can already see, some destruction. And then you jump about 6 months later. And then this was taken on the 4th of January. This is the exact same crossroads. You can see the difference here. A huge difference. I mean, this building's just gone. It doesn't exist. You can see the direct impact that probably, or one of the direct impacts that absolutely wrecked it. You can see every little one of these dots is a shell crater. You can see as some of these larger munitions, probably 152 millimeter actual artillery rounds have impacted here, and they are walking them. You can see all of these are likely BM-21 grads. These are 40, these are 122 millimeter Katyusha high explosive rockets, just saturating this area. Rockets being fired from aircraft. You can see the trench line being dug here. You see the backhoe that's digging it there, an impromptu trench line. You see the trenches that have formed along the side of the road here. You have some communications trenches. So you can see exactly just the level of destruction that's taken place here. There's not quite a way better, I think, to describe it. And they go on and actually post more. Once again, this is August. This is in August. January 3rd. These are released January 3rd, I should clarify. Once again, August. January. The level of destruction is just incomprehensible.
Я шагаю один, но как белый пол.
Хватит? Да, вперед. Хватит, что нам не доходит. Довольно. Давай.
Качка!
Огонь!
Блядь. Снимай, не надо.
Давай, достреляй!
Зарядив. Давай.
Пострел!
Качка!
Давай. Хватит? And they're suffering pretty tremendous losses too. You can see this would be considered a catastrophic kill of this vehicle. It's a BMP. And you can see obviously some battle damage here, but you can see what kills it, and it's this right here. You can see the impact right there. That's definitely an HE, probably a single charge warhead that ends up hitting it. A larger warhead like a tow missile would not quite, it doesn't make that quite that big of a hole because of the way the shape charge works, but this looks like a single charge warhead, probably an RPG round. punches right through the armor. And you can see just how thin the armor is. You can see into the vehicle. And you can see the armor is very thin. Very thin. These infantry fighting vehicles, the BMP series, do not carry very thick armor whatsoever. Very thin armor, essentially paper thin in terms of armor technique and thickness and angle of deflection, as well as you're looking at the composition of a lot of these armors. This is not a composite armor, meaning it's not made of both steel and ceramic mix and laminate mix, but it's mostly what's cold rolled homogeneous steel. The older way of the original way of making tanks was cold rolled homogeneous steel, and which is just taking steel and folding it a bunch of times, rolling it until it makes a super hard surface. Made them very heavy, made them very thick, and it did not provide an immense amount of protection against newer, more advanced weapon systems. And you see that puncture right there. That really kind of gives the indicator of, yes, this looks like it was a. This definitely looks like it was a RPG hit. Seems like a pretty immense detonation. So, very heavy fighting in and around Bakhmut. And it really illustrates that the amount of artillery videos you're seeing out of Bakhmut really illustrates kind of the focus of the war. Is really that heavy usage of artillery. We saw the 105s there, which I'm sure if Rob is still here watching with us, Rob could attest that was his weapon system. And we can see, those artillery crews, they're taking whatever artillery they can and they're just trying to throw it back, because the Russian guns actually outnumber 10 to 1. Now, their capability, their rates of fire have significantly decreased because of logistical strains. But we have seen, it's a 10 to 1 advantage numerically of Russian artillery versus Ukrainian. So, but absolutely brutal fighting. You can see the mud, you can see the difficulty in that area, and we continue every single day at this point that we're live, report on Solidar and Bakhmut, and the absolute brutal fighting ongoing there. Some things are still on the up and up, though, and Ukrainian forces, while the flanks are holding in places such as Marinka and Avdiivka here around the city of Donetsk, that has allowed for artillery to return to work. Despite offensive operations against Avdiivka and Marinka, which has seen some brutal fighting over the past couple of weeks that have caused for Ukrainian artillery to kind of hold back a little bit as they are wondering if their positions may become overrun. It would appear that precision strikes have resumed on Russian targets in and around the city of Donetsk itself. This time, they ended up striking one of the metallurgical sites, or a steel mill, essentially, inside of the city of Donetsk, which was being used as a logistical support center, meaning is being used by Russian forces in order to repair their vehicles that were receiving battle damage, in order to get them back out and on the road and get them back into the engagement or providing logistical support. That site is no longer being used. It was struck by Ukrainian precision-guided munitions as of last night. It's not the only strike we've seen, but we do get kind of an interesting video coming out here. So this right here, this is the this right here is actually the BMP-3. The BMP-3 is a very unique vehicle. So you have BMPs and you have BMDs and you have multiple different types of vehicles. So this is really cool. The BMP-3 is a very cool vehicle, because you have the BMP-1, which has a large cannon, small anti-tank gun essentially that's mounted onto it, high velocity cannon. And then you have the BMP-2, which has a smaller caliber, basically automatic cannon, a 20 millimeter automatic cannon. And then you have the BMP-3, which actually has dual-mounted guns. You can see the autocannon there, and you can actually see a larger anti-tank gun there as well. High-velocity cannon there. So very thinly armored, maintains the same chassis, but has some different integral components. Very interesting combat vehicle. One of the newer models, the BMP, which makes it a little bit more effective. It actually does have some composite armor to it. This is inside of a Ukrainian BMP-3 while it is engaging Russian forces. So pretty interesting video that you really don't get to see a whole lot of. So kind of a cool video. You really don't get to see the inside of those much. I've never actually seen the inside of a BMP-3, let alone one actually firing. I've been on the inside of a BMP-1, but not a BMP-3. Meltdown received a surprise gift from Ukrainian forces today. Another successful strike hit Meltdown. Meltdown has been used as a Russian military installation. The airport just outside the city has been a major Russian base. And Russian forces outside the city of Meltdown ended up receiving yet another nasty surprise as of January the 8th. Ukrainian precision-guided missiles fired from HIMARS and M270 systems rained down on the key logistical communications command and barracks areas around the airport, striking critical military infrastructure and causing what I have labeled here as subsequent sympathetic detonations, meaning that ammunition, fuel, and other things have now heated up in the fires that were started by the explosions, and those have now also detonated too. So quite a large number of destroyed vehicles. We get a nice photo there coming from a resident there in Meltdown. You see the fire coming up from that. And we have some sound to go along with us. Barbara Christina asks, has U.S. sent BMP-3? No. The United States has not, because the United States doesn't use the BMP-3. The BMP-3 was designed by the Soviet Union to make up for the lacks of the other two. The BMP-2 didn't have a large main gun to engage other pieces of armor, essentially, and also hit hardened emplacements, while the 20mm cannon provided a coaxial support. Also, the BMP-1 was outdated in its design and didn't have the rapid fire capabilities that the BMP-2 could. So they wanted to marry them up together and create an effective infantry fighting vehicle for a cheaper cost. And that kind of is the theme with Russian forces, is cheap cost, cheap build, large quantity. Really a quantity over quality mentality. These systems, all Russian systems, are relatively analog. They don't rely on a heavy usage of electronic components. They're very old-fashioned in their design, and they heavily rely on analog systems. Whereas things like NATO vehicles have a lot of electronic systems built into them, a lot of newer technologies, the forward edge of technology in the battle space, really. But the BMP-3, has some cool capability. It has a low profile and can provide a lot of heavy gun support, and it also is chambering, and a lot of the weapon systems are chambering in calibers that are already in significant number inside of Ukraine, just because of the kind of systems. It's a Soviet system, Soviet-style system. They would have already probably had some in their stockpile, and then they probably have also received quite a large donation from Russia themselves by leaving all their stuff behind. Bookham 40 says, I heard the U.S. is planning to train 500 Ukrainian troops per month on a Bradley, a much better vehicle than BMP-3. It also infers that the U.S. will begin supplying more than 50 Bradleys. Yeah, that's completely possible. The Bradley's kind of getting phased out. And there's actually talk of the U.S. supplying the Stryker, too, which is another U.S. Army system. The Stryker, Stryker is one of those that it blurs the difference between an infantry fighting vehicle and a armored personnel carrier. because it does both, and it has multiple packages to where it mounts like huge anti-tank guns, like a 70 millimeter gun it can mount, but then it can also turn around and mount, a 50 caliber, a 50 BMG M2 in a Crow system. So they're an older system that are already kind of getting phased out. A lot of systems are kind of in this transition. The U.S. is kind of in a transition of, if you look at a lot of the equipment of the Iraq War, and also Desert Storm, the Bradley has a lot of great development, but the Bradley was the immediate replacement of the M113, which was outdated by the time it really probably saw service back in Vietnam. And the Bradley has a really high profile, has a great gun, has been super reliable with its crews, able to do a lot of work, has already proven itself very effectively in combat, loved by everyone that supported it, hated by anyone that's never had to deal with it. But the thing is that it doesn't have a lot of armor. It's literally an aluminum armor, infantry fighting vehicle. So it doesn't have a lot of protection, which is very noticeable. If you look at the Gulf War, you see a significant loss in the Bradleys because of the lack of armor. That's where their casualties come in quite significantly, is the Gulf War. So it's got problems. I mean, every vehicle has pros and cons. It's more or less about how you use them. And we'll get to some of that later here too. I have a nice rant at the end of the stream for you guys tonight. But the Striker MGS has a 105. I apologize. I never had to deal with Strikers, and it has problems though. Yes, it does. And once again, every vehicle system is going to have problems. There's no two ways about it, but it's pros and cons for all. Barbara Christina asks, UK Navy sending Challenger tanks to Ukraine, but these are old tanks, aren't they? Sorry, I asked too many questions. No, I implore you to ask questions to further your understanding. Yes, the United Kingdom is talking about sending the Challenger, specifically the Challenger 2. Now, the Challenger 2 did have a precursor. It did have the original Challenger, the Challenger 1, British main tank for the British Ground Forces. The Challenger 2 is the current main battle tank of British Ground Forces. And the Challenger 2 is nothing like Challenger 1. They basically completely designed a brand new tank for the Challenger 2, even though they kept the namesake in the class. So it's I'd say a relatively brand new tank. It's a very effective tank on the battlefield. I would say it very much can rival the M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, that generation of main battle tanks. And they've received additional armor packages for the lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. So much like the U.S. equipment, while it may be old, like the Abrams is old tank relatively in its design, they have received numerous upgrades and refits and redesigns that have been with lessons learned from fighting wars throughout this period of time, so extended period of time. So there's a lot of good things to say. I have nothing bad to say about the Challenger 2. I have nothing bad to say about French tanks. If they want to give them the Leclerc, please feel free to do so. I will always be down for France giving up their Leclercs, especially since they will probably just end up surrendering should they become engaged anyway. We continue over here where we get to see a little bit of something interesting to talk about, which is a SEAD mission. SEAD stands for Suppression of Enemy Air Defense, which is a term used for a fire mission. SEAD is used by basically every military in the world, and you have to suppress an enemy air defense system and then engage it. It's usually an artillery fire mission. It has a pause in it that allows the aircraft to allows the aircraft to actually come in and strike the target by keeping it under constant artillery suppression, except for a very short window. It appears that this one it is actually a radar system. It was the P-18-2, which is it's a second model following the P-18 made by the Soviet Union. It's a surveillance, a tracking radar, and what has happened is the SEAD mission has occurred against the radar system that allowed for a Ukrainian aircraft to fire an AGM-88 HARM missile, which therefore being picked up on the radar and ended up impacting that radar system and just successfully destroying it. So that will make it much more difficult to direct anti-air systems, as well as provide correction data for artillery crews. And you can see the destruction of this. This is definitely 100% a kill. There is no recovery. But in very successful SEAD, and you can see where some of these artillery strikes were coming in and hitting this as well, as it was under suppression. And the reason they're doing this is because of the prolific shelling of Kherson and the Kherson region. It's indiscriminate shelling once again, war crime against humanity to continue doing it as is. And as they continue to strike the city at liberated areas of the Kherson Oblast, the most recent shelling ended up killing one person, according to Amin Dzepar, who's the first deputy of Foreign Affairs. Some of these strikes are reported to have included the 9S-22M incendiary munition. And so the first strike, we do unfortunately see that casualty, which has been blurred out. And you can see the impacts here. Just landing just randomly in the city. And as for the incendiary munitions usage, I think this speaks for itself. If you happen to be in Ukraine and you happen to be an individual that is living in an area that is under incendiary munitions shelling, do not open the window. Incendiary munitions, white phosphorus, and other incendiary munitions, including the incendiary compounds in the 9S-22M, are poisonous. They're toxic. The gases that they release as they are burning, it is a chemical reaction. It's not like regular smoke. This is not like regular smoke. It's not caused just by flame, burning, whatever. This is two chemicals burning. These are multiple chemicals, generally speaking, that are ignited, and it is chemical gas that is being expelled here, as well as whatever these have ignited on the ground, on top of regular smoke. So please, if you were like this guy was lucky, you can see the wind's actually blowing it away from him. But if you see this and you want to film it, do not open your window. It is poisonous. It can cause serious damage to you. It could even kill you if you inhale enough. Do not open your window. And please, I highly implore that if you are in an area like this, you should likely evacuate. But incendiary munitions are no joke. Incendiary munitions are extremely inhumane. I fathom harder. I cannot really think of a probably a worse way to go than incendiary munition. It's very difficult to think of a worse way to go. Even things like sarin gas and stuff, as horrific as they are, usually kills you relatively quickly, as they're nerve agents. I don't think this is one of those. This definitely is ranked in my top 3 ways of I do not want to go. It's not technically chemical warfare; it's incendiary munitions. The chemical warfare part of that is actually, it's not considered to be a purpose-built chemical agent. It happens to just be considered to be a byproduct. Regardless, it is a war crime, and the reason why it's a war crime is because of Additional Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1983, which prevents the usage of incendiary munitions being used against densely populated civilian areas by any means of delivery, ground or air. And it also is in violation of Additional Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, adopted in 1977, but it's also in violation of Rule number 85 of customary international humanitarian law, which states you cannot use incendiary weaponry on any military personnel unless you cannot find another effective way of rendering them hors to combat, with therefore meaning combat ineffective. Especially horrendous. This is not the only city to have been struck. In fact, a city in Mykolaiv has been as well. Massive artillery bombardment that occurred here in Ushakiv. This is just across the Dnipro here from this little sector of Mykolaiv Oblast, which is in the peninsula here. Was shelled pretty horrendously. According to Vitaly Kim, who is the head of the Mykolaiv Regional Military Administration, roughly 100 residential homes have been damaged or destroyed, with at least 15 people being wounded. However, they are expecting that number to rise as people are literally wandering in, dazed and wounded, into hospitals on foot.
Ну, судя по тому, что я вижу, то тут, конечно, всего района нету. Крышу он посносило, разносило все к чертовой матери. Да, да.
I'm sure we will receive additional updates from there here shortly. That is actually all of the news inside of the country of Ukraine. But that's not all of the news dealing with Ukraine in general. As we get ready to move into the international news, there's quite a few things happening. And we actually get, as we move over here to Rostov-on-Don, some more clarification on what happened over in Makivka. So Anton Golovinsky was stationed in the building in Makivka, and he describes his unit was forced to gather in the gymnasium to watch Putin's New Year's speech, despite all the locals knowing about it. He died in a hospital in Rostov from severe burns and injuries. This is one of those locations which was struck by Ukrainian HIMARS on the New Year's. He recounts his story.
Разместили в здании ПТУ. Мы просили расположить нас отдельно, не всех вместе. Новогоднюю ночь нас собрали в актовом зале прослушать речь президента. Мы просили этого не делать. Все местные об этом знали, все об этом знали. Нам сказали выполнять приказ этого полковника. Это преступный приказ. Полковника зовут Роман Яникеев. Это из-за него погибли почти все наши ребята. Я чудом остался жив. Все командиры только и думали, как быстрее уехать домой, как быстрее оттуда уехать. Нас специально оставили там. Всех собрали в одном месте. Этого нельзя было делать. Ни в коем случае. Как я остался жив чудом.
In the end, he did not make it. Once again, it is reported that he died due to his severe burns and other injuries. And while that was happening, everyone else was being moved, much like much like under the Nazi regime, the movement of unwanted people, such as the Jews, Poles, and other ethnic minorities and unwanted individuals in the Nazi regime. Russian troops who are mobilized are being moved through Russia in cattle cars. Now, the reason why I compare it to what the Reich did is because the vast majority of individuals who are conscripted are not from Moscow or St. Petersburg. The vast majority of people conscripted into Russian service are from places in Siberia, places in the far east of Russia, places in the southern sector of Russia, such as Dagestan, Chechnya, places over by Mongolia. These are people who are ethnic minorities, not in their regions, but as Russia would see it. They're not true white Russians from Moscow or St. Petersburg. They are not Muscovites. And so these individuals who are unwanted by the Russian government, who have actually been suppressed by the Russian government quite heavily, and forcibly relocated in many cases, are being sent in cattle cars as if they are cows to a slaughterhouse.
Видео, короче, для потомков. Вот так вот на войну люди собираются. Хлеб весь сложили, все слетело. Вот это такой туалет. Вот это вот кухня, готовить на ней нужно. А вот это бочка с водой.
Это Захар.
Тут куча барахла, короче, которая непонятно куда складывать. А и печка вот не стоит. А скоро уже ехать, через пару часов. Холодно и темно. Ни света, ничего. Ну вот так вот, короче, ребята.
The sad reality of the war in Ukraine is that either way you look at it, Russia wins something in the end. If they win the war in Ukraine, they will have successfully committed genocide and ethnic cleansing against Ukrainian people based off of national lines. If they lose the war in Ukraine, if Russia loses the war in Ukraine, they have successfully committed ethnic cleansing against places such as Dagestan, Chechnya, Siberia, and the places of the Far East where the majority of their personnel were conscripted. Ethnic minorities in a white Russia. From the poorest regions, despite being some of the most oil rich. That is the reality of Russia. You jump up here into Moscow, where according to Kadarovites on television there in Russia, they explain the dire need for another mobilization and that everyone, including school children, should prepare to defend the motherland. This is increasing rhetoric we're seeing on Russian TV.
Какие-то паники поднимают по поводу того, что там, вот, скажем, если была бы там еще одна волна мобилизации. А на самом деле, я вам честно скажу, волна мобилизации, я считаю, она должна быть еще вчера. Мы должны готовить наше население и в школах, и повсеместно к тому, что если уж развернутся такие события, что мы все должны встать в один строй, то есть нам не надо озираться, думая, что мы скажем что-то страшное. Это Третья мировая война, и мы должны быть к этому готовы. Там кто-то какие-то паники поднимает.
You cannot make these photos up. We're seeing increasing amounts of rhetoric from the Russians of a push regarding mobilizations. We think that this may be, as many others do, maybe in preparation, getting the population of Russia mentally prepared for a larger mobilization process, possibly even a larger one than we already saw. The rhetoric continues. A Happy New Year's message. A Happy New Year message for the West. Chechirina, a Russian singer who has already went to visit Donbass and sing for the occupiers, recorded a New Year's message that was aired on national Russian TV.
Десятки лет потребительства пытались сделать из нас аморфную биомассу. Мы долго терпели. Мы долго терпели, когда на Донбассе расстреливали наших бабушек в огородах и электриках на столбах. Убитый младенец на разорванной груди матери. Девочка, расстрелянная кассетными бомбами на детском пляже. И многие преступления, на которые весь цивилизованный мир так долго закрывал глаза. Пришло время платить по счетам. Посоветую укропам, сдавайтесь, все ваши грехи вымерзнут в наших гулагах, и вы вернетесь чистенькими в наш русский мир, который переплавит все. А всем верным скажу, время настоящей свободы, о которой мы все мечтали, пришло. Сейчас самое время выбирать, кем мы хотим стать. Бессмертными героями или бесславными предателями. Каждый должен стать на своем посту, на своем фронте, на защиту нашей Родины. Всех братьев по оружию поздравляю с наступающим 2023 годом. Ура! Десятки лет...
I think it speaks for itself. Meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that Ukraine was planning to falsify evidence of war crimes committed by Russian forces, including that of torture, execution, and much more. Evidence of such actions has already been uncovered in numerous amounts, including during independent investigations by the United Nations. Continual evidence of war crimes, including indiscriminate shelling from, once again, the 1949 Convention, Protocol 1, adopted in 1977, usage of incendiary munitions, Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, Protocol 3, a summary execution, the 1949 Geneva Convention, and a multitude of others have already become common knowledge and evidence amounts against various Russian commands. Under the given circumstances, and under the definition provided by the Rome Statute, in 1993, Russian forces could be considered to have committed crimes against humanity via the systematic usage of methods and equipment banned under multiple conventions in international law. Once again, coming from the official Twitter of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation in English. It is also in Russian. Meanwhile, Putin aims to end Greco membership. Putin signing the inability for the Russian Federation to take part in discussions or vote in monitoring mission of Greco. Greco, which stands for Group of States Against Corruption, was created by the Council of Europe in 1999 in order to monitor compliance with anti-corruption standards in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and widespread corruption in newly formed states once part of the Soviet bloc. According to the NGO Transparency International and their 2021 Corruption Perceptions Index, which was released on January of 2022, Russia actually ranked 136th out of 180, scoring only 29, 0 being the highest corruption, 100 being almost no corruption. Russia was the lowest ranked European nation on the index. Coming from TASS itself, TASS being a Russian state-run news agency, having started in 1908. Meanwhile, we have something that's apparently not worthy to comment on. As evidence of war crimes continues to mount, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, Nebenzia, stated that the idea of a special tribunal for Russian war crimes in Ukraine was simply ridiculous and not worthy of commenting on. The European Union, along with Ukraine and a multitude of other nations, have created growing calls to make a special tribunal similar to those created after World War II for Russian forces. This tribunal would put politicians and military forces on trial and convict them, if deemed guilty, of a set list of charges, likely ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, etc. This actually comes to us from Sputnik, which is owned by RT. But there is hope for an anti-Putin Russia, and that actually comes from Cheboksky, which is in the Chuvashia Republic in Russia. There's still hope for an anti-Putin Russia. The Z symbol, which has been put up here in the city, has been vandalized for the third time in a row. It has once again been destroyed. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, if we jump over here to Poland, the Polish Prime Minister announced plans to give Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Quote, I discussed with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz a few weeks ago in Brussels, and I think that in the coming days we'll be able to provide more information, end quote. That's what the Polish Prime Minister stated. This move is meant to inspire other countries to give Ukraine heavier equipment and weapons. And that's coming from Prime Minister Morawiecki there in Poland. Poland does operate quite a considerable number of the Leopard 2 main battle tank that was provided to Poland by Germany in order to replace their aging Soviet-style tanks that they currently still have in their main tank force. So, coming from Czechia is saying that T-72s are on their way. Czechia's Prime Minister Peter Fiala posted a photograph of himself signing the bore evacuator on the barrel of a T-72 tank, stating it was a message to Ukrainian troops as this was part of a new batch of main battle tanks It is a part of a new main batch of main battle tanks from the close Ukrainian ally would be sending to the embattled country of Ukraine. Ukraine stated rather publicly that it would take for Ukraine to launch another major counteroffensive an additional 450 armored vehicles. While they continue to capture and repair Russian armor, Ukrainian forces are being supplied with additional artillery pieces, at least 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, T-72s, mortar infantry fighting vehicles, and much likely more, but not officially announced yet. Coming from Peter Fiala, once again, that photo I was just talking about. And Zelensky, again, of course, giving his thanks. Meanwhile, in Germany, coming from Kastrop Rossell, Germany, a terror plot was thwarted by German intelligence. German intelligence agencies have detained an Iranian citizen who was preparing a terrorist attack using toxic substances. The operation took place in Kastrop Rossell the day before. And during a search in the house of the detainee, the security forces seized cyanide and resin. The Dusseldorf prosecutor's office assumes that the detainee is an Islamist and planned to commit a terrorist attack. However, what specific target was the suspect chose and his affiliation with any group has yet to be clarified. He faces up to 10 years in prison. And there was a joint press release statement made. As we continue down here and into Istanbul, two Islamic State militants were arrested. Turkish intelligence agency announced that they had arrested two militants of the Islamic State associated with its Afghan branch of Vilayat Khorasan, who is allegedly planned to stage a New Year's terrorist attack in Istanbul. Meanwhile, as we move over here to Ankara, Turkish Barkan robots successfully fired laser-guided mini-missiles. The Barkan is a medium-sized UGV, or unmanned ground vehicle, fully designed and manufactured by the Turkish company Havelsan to offer a new generation of a multi-role robotic platform that can be configured to perform a wide range of missions. The Barkan UGV is electrically powered and can reach a top speed of 25 kilometers an hour, or 15 miles per hour, with an endurance of up to 6 hours of runtime. The METE UGV can be controlled manually or in an autonomous mode, using an onboard GPS communication system at a max range of 5 kilometers or 3.1 miles. The vehicle is also equipped with day and night vision, GSM, and satellite communication systems, and an upgradable perimeter surveillance system with a 5-kilometer line of sight. The 40mm meat missile has an effective range of 1 kilometer and a circular error probability of 1 meter or less, meaning it will strike at the intended target within 1 meter. And which makes it extremely effective. We do actually have a video here. It does have unfortunately some copyright music to it. It's not a very big robot. It's a very small robot actually. But you can see here it's a unmanned ground vehicle essentially. And you can see it launch its little 40mm laser guided missile here. And it's 40mm, but there you go. Nice effect on target. So they have tested it. We'll be able to do more, but it's a very interesting concept. We're starting to see UGVs and things really, start to come into their own. We're starting to see drone development really starting to pick up when it comes to the defense sector, and hybrid capabilities really being brought into the defense sector quite an extensive amount. We see that with the development with DARPA projects right now, the Abrams X, the Stryker X, a lot of stuff. So it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes and the actual tactical feasibility and employment of UGVs like that one. Jump down here and into Egypt, where in El Quantrera, a cargo ship ended up running aground. A cargo ship carrying corn went aground early on Monday in the Suez Canal and was refloated, and traffic through the crucial waterway was restored. The vessel, owned by Greek firm Primera Shipping Incorporated, was heading to China before it broke down at the 38-kilometer or 24-mile mark of the canal near the city of Qantara in the province of Ismailia. After being refloated, the vessel was towed to the nearby maritime park to fix the problem. Jumping over here into Sananjaj here in Iran. Protests do continue. People ran continuing the nationwide protest challenging the regime. This is a very significant, as we are seeing, especially when you take into account the latest executions.
مرد بر خامنه‌ای همه ایران برادران تشنه خون رهبران مرد بر دیکتاتور مرد بر دیکتاتور سنا هزیده
So pretty interesting to see, and it's pretty great to see that they are still definitely kind of trying to stick up for themselves and kind of trying to overthrow what's really quite a terrible regime, as we've quickly learned. I apologize. It would appear that my co-host would like some attention. Are you going to come here? Yes? No? Maybe so? Oh. Hello. Have you decided to come and join us? So, this would be Inky, the co-host. One of the other co-hosts. So we come over here and we jump into Pakistan, where we see 2 militants were killed during a counterterrorism operation here in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. Security forces eliminated 2 militants. The operation took place near the town of Banu, where law enforcement officers blocked the house of where militants were hiding. When offered to surrender, militants responded with fire. During the shootout, the attackers were neutralized. According to security officials, the militants were involved in the attack on a police patrol on January the 7th. Then, during the shelling, an employee of the Ministry of Internal Affairs was killed and another was seriously injured. The authorities believe that the liquidated militants were members of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan group, or TTP. Jumping down here into Africa, we come over here into the Shabelle region of Somalia, where 61 al-Shabaab militants were reported to have been killed by Somali security forces. And several were injured in a planned operation by the National Intelligence and Security Forces and international partners in a field on the outskirts of Hawadlai district in Shabelle. In addition, the operation destroyed 2 vehicles, a Homai and a Noah, which were loaded with explosives and planned to be delivered to Mogadishu. And that is the official report coming out for the Ministry of Information, Culture, and Tourism. A very interesting combination there. And why they're delivering that message is kind of concerning. Meanwhile, over in Somalia, Ethiopian National Defense Forces were attacked. The Oromo Liberation Army, or the OLA, attacked the ENDF camp at the West Guji zone, displaying trophies accordingly. And it is quite a massive cache. Just look how many weapons they ended up seizing from the military there. Quite a significant number. Meanwhile, if we come over here into Senegal, 40 people were killed and dozens were injured in a bus crash. At least 40 people were killed and dozens injured in a bus crash in central Senegal. President Macky Sall declared 3 days of mourning starting Monday and said he will hold an interministerial council to discuss road safety measures. Public prosecutor Sheikh Dieng said that the crash happened on National Road 1 when a public bus punctured a tire and veered across the road, colliding with another bus coming from the opposite direction. Coming from the official Twitter of Macky Sall. And see some of that footage from the bus accident there. Move over here and across the Atlantic and into Brazil. We're coming out of Brasilia, Brazil. Bolsonaro supporters stormed key government buildings. Supporters of Brazilian far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro, who refused to accept his electoral defeat, have stormed the presidential palace, Congress, and Supreme Court in the capital of Brasilia. Videos on social media showed Bolsonaro supporters smashing windows and furniture at the National Congress and Supreme Court buildings on Sunday. Security forces used tear gas in an effort to push back demonstrators, with local media estimating about 3,000 people were involved in the incident.
Muita gente lá fora, pessoal. A polícia não conseguiu conter o povo. Não conseguiu conter o povo. Quebraram as janelas, quebraram tudo, entraram dentro da casa, quebraram tudo.
Estão avançando mais aqui, ó. Tropa montada ali atrás.
And this was actually sent in by one of our viewers, someone who is actually part of the community. This was sent in by Orisk. And now we get to the Paul rant. Please get better idols. Thank you, Bailey Sarian, for giving me that line. But get better idols. It's important to not listen to everything on the internet, folks. And I talk about this every single time I go onto the stream. Please do your own research. Game developer and space tourer Richard Garriott created a Twitter tweet on 6th of January stating, quote, "Tanks, mighty as they seem on the face of, seems a bit old school. Seems like light mobile GPS drone and sat targeting items are dominating these days. Am I missing something? Are tanks still superior when backed up like carriers are backed up in a fleet?" End quote. And given the war in Ukraine, the battlefield armored losses, that would be an excellent, that would be an excellent question to actually ask. Like, that's not a problem. Everyone, even top brass, has asked that question. I've asked that question myself. Like, is my job going to be, is my job in the Marine Corps like going to be meaningful, in the next 15, 20 years? Will any of what I say be applicable? And only time will tell. But it's been pretty well summed up of, yeah, I probably will be, and I'll get to that. But Elon Musk, who bought Twitter, replied to this and stated, quote, "Tanks are a death trap now. With neither side having air superiority, you're left with infantry and artillery, essentially World War I." End quote. That reply to that tweet was viewed 13 million times. It was retweeted 1,299 times, quoted and retweeted 1,451 times, and received 22,600 likes. More than the original tweet itself. No one cared about the question, only cared about the answer, because of who it was stated by. And so this has been largely talked about. I've seen several major news organizations talking about this since these tweets occurred. And, they're providing commentary on it. So I'd like to follow suit and cue my well-known moment of a Paul rant. So coming from Elon Musk. This is the original tweet. And it was actually started, you actually quoted Tendar. This is a Funker 530 vehicle. This is of a TOW2. This is a TOW2 Bravo. That is a TOW2 Alpha tube up there. That is a TOW2 Bravo. That's hitting a fully loaded, meaning full ammunition, full fuel, a T-72. So you can get to see, which is exactly what you're seeing. That's why he asked this question. He's like, I see these videos and I see what happens in the war in Ukraine and stuff like that, and I can't help but go, is it still a viable thing? Are tanks still important? Are they still superior when backed up? And Elon Musk replied, tanks are a death trap now, with neither side having air superiority. You're left with infantry and artillery, essentially World War One. Once again, 13 million views. This one doesn't even have that many views. It's 11.3 million. So people only cared about the answer. And people were going back and talking about, it was invented to give an advantage to break the deadlock of trench warfare in World War One. That is true. Tanks have developed in the last 100 years. And their concept has developed in the last 100 years. With the Renault FT being the first main battle tank that you can... I say main battle tank. The Renault FT, which is actually also loaned and was Patton's first command, being part of the 2nd Armored Division, was actually the first thing that it was a French design. And that really designs the beginning of tanks, like how tanks get their design now, with a top moving turret, which is crewed by one person and has a 37 millimeter main gun, which was perfectly acceptable at the time. But Elon Musk knows nothing about tanks, anti-tank warfare, or anything like that. The man can make spaceships and whatever else he wants, but stay the hell out of tanks. He doesn't know anything about tanks. He doesn't know anything about the history of tank warfare. He doesn't know about anti-armor possibilities. He doesn't know about reactive armor systems. He doesn't know about any of this stuff. He's not an expert. He knows nothing. He doesn't know anything. No experience. Doesn't have any say on the possibility, but he's rich and famous, and he bought Twitter, so people will listen to him. Get better idols. Twitter is also failing, so I mean, he doesn't even know how to do that either. But don't listen to people just because they're famous and may seem to know what they're talking about. It's frustrating when I see people like this, and I see people listening to it, because he has no basis on this. There's no basis on this. So I would actually like to answer Richard Garriott's question, and as someone who is a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine, as well as armored vehicles, because it was my job in the Marine Corps. So, as an answer to your question, Richard Garriott, yes, tanks are still superior on the battlefield, but when they're backed up. Armored warfare is a messy thing. In the history of armored warfare, tanks have been called many things. There is no direct quotes, but it has been stated since World War II that the M3 Lee, developed prior to the Sherman, was produced as the interwar period. It really shows off the United States not being prepared for World War II. On the very flat open terrain, when these M3 Lees were provided to the Soviet Union as part of the Lend-Lease, the Soviet soldiers, the Soviet crew members, called the M3 Lee the coffin for 7 brothers. There are quotations of the Sherman tank, the M4 Sherman, widely considered one of the most successful battle tanks ever made in eye-watering numbers. Made specifically for service, being able to be serviced very easily in the field with minimal setup because of its ability to be shipped in such large numbers to the front lines with everything needed to support it. One of the most successful logistical challenges ever overcome in military history, and also one of the most successful battle tanks, being used by almost every single side in the war. Even the Germans taking them and using them whenever they were them captured, or at least providing them to some of the minor Axis allies for use. And they also had a bad notoriety, and by some people, especially when you're talking about later in the war, when they're coming up against equipment that is made and has been developed and has been around for some time and is now in some quantity that easily penetrates German armor, or penetrates the armor of the Sherman, which it's not particularly heavy armor anyway. It's a medium tank. It's not a heavy tank. It wasn't designed to be, it wasn't meant to be a Tiger tank or a Panther or a Mouse or a KV-1 or an IS-1 or an IS-2. So tanks have always had, because of their design features, because they're just like anything else, tanks are a tool. Tanks are a tool in the toolbox. You can use a hammer to put in a screw. And you can use a screwdriver to put in a nail. But it's a lot easier if you do it the other way around. They are a tool. You can use them correctly and get the job done as intended, or you can make it very hard on yourself and possibly completely screw up the job. Break things, destroy things. Maybe you get the job done, but it might be very messy. So it's a tool, just like a rifle is a tool, just like a multi-tool is a tool, just like an anti-tank missile is a tool. They're designed for a specific task. And people, there's a definition for what a tank does. It's pretty fantastic, if you ask me. A tank is a heavily armored vehicle up to the equivalent of 1,000 millimeters of armor, mounting a large caliber cannon, 90 millimeter or above, and a large, fully enclosed, heavily armored turret. It must have tracks. It has excellent cross-country mobility, armor protection, firepower, the capability of producing a shock effect on the threat. A tank is an offensive weapon designed to fire and maneuver and assault through an objective. Remember, all tanks are armored vehicles, but not all armored vehicles are tanks. That is the job of the tank. It is a support unit. And just like everything else in the military, whether you're talking about artillery, you're talking about supply, you're talking about aircraft, you're talking about tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, the bread and butter of war, no matter how mechanized, no matter how advanced or how simplistic, the bread and butter of war is the infantry. The infantry is the ones that are going to close with, destroy the enemy. They're going to get into the trench. They're going to clear the trench. They're going to push the enemy out. They're going to hold the ground. They're going to dig the holes. They're the ones that are going to do the dirty work. Everything else is a supporting asset. You look at the war in Ukraine, and you're looking at, especially early on in the war, both sides really employing old Soviet doctrine. And the Russians, they don't have infantry battalions. They don't have infantry regiments. They have motorized infantry regiment, the 44th motorized infantry regiment, the 59th mechanized infantry regiment. All of their units, they don't have light infantry. Their paratroopers, the VDV Corps, utilizes the BMD series, which has collapsible suspension on their armored vehicles patterned off of the BMPs. Collapsible suspension on them to specifically be able to load into an aircraft. Theoretically can be airdropped, but is likely so that way they can roll it into an armor. That way the air assault can happen, and then they can land an aircraft and drop off armored vehicles to support the VDV troops that got dropped off in the air assault. So the Russian army is heavily mechanized. They took the idea and they put it to the far extreme of everything. They put it to the way far extreme. And what you see in the war in Ukraine is that armor isn't being used as a supported asset. It's being used as the asset. And because they don't have infantry support, because they're not being improperly employed in support of an infantry assault, but rather, there's mutual support from the infantry to protect the armored vehicles, you're seeing catastrophic destruction of armored vehicles as a result of very easily avoidable situations of anti-armor warfare. Easy tactics. And it not perfect. Even if they were doing everything perfect, they would still be taking heavy losses, because the truth is that two industrial nations haven't fought each other since World War II. The Gulf War was Saddam Hussein, who's had the seventh most powerful army in the world, versus the United States. Saddam was an industrial power. He was an oil-rich nation and a dictator who had his entire air defense system patterned off of, you guessed it, the Soviet Union. Soviet Union and the United States didn't fight a war. Germany didn't invade its neighbor like it usually does, has throughout history. Two industrial nations haven't really fought each other. So you are going to see much higher catastrophic kills because the ground firepower ratio, the ratio of capability between Russian and Ukrainian forces is so near equal. The Russians aren't employing their stuff correctly. And Ukraine doesn't have to be as good as NATO. They just have to be better than the Russians. Because in war, there's only two types of people. There's no second place. There's no third place. You either win or you die. And that's... So you don't have to be as good as NATO. You just have to be better than the other guy, which is the Russians. And they don't really employ their stuff correctly. I see all the time watching these videos, like, yeah, I would have done the same thing. Like, javelin kills. But I've also seen where Ukrainian anti-armor teams really don't employ themselves correctly, but because the Russians are so bad at supporting their armor that they get wiped out. I've seen Ukrainian forces employ horrendously in anti-armor postures and still come out easily wiping the floor with the Russians. Whereas anything that I've seen, I would have got my head kicked in for it because it was so blatantly wrong. And it would have been so easy to have just wiped out the anti-armor team before they could have engaged. Early on in the war, seeing entire tank, divisions essentially coming down the highway and then bottlenecking at the front, with getting impacts from ATGM teams from the sides. Those very famous videos, easily avoided. Infantry on the flanks. Come on, guys, have infantry sweep through the wood line. Would have immediately annihilated like half of the gunnery crews that made successful strikes on the tanks. And it's great to see it in hindsight, and it's, I don't have to look at it from their point of view, but the Russians have been horrendous in their employment. They've been horrendous in their battlefield technique, and their anti-armor warfare situation hasn't had to have been good because they weren't exactly up against anything great in the first place. I'd say that their anti-armor capability impressive with their hit rates, but outside of accuracy, not really much, to talk about. I mean, they're not really doing great. They're not fantastic or anything. They're just kind of okay in how they're employing themselves. But that's okay because they're way better than the Russians anyway. So, in short answer, tanks are still superior on the battlefield. Tanks are still superior on the battlefield, Richard. That's the reality of it. But they're superior when they're supported. You go it alone, you fail alone too. And that's what we see with the Russians, is just over and over again. They get annihilated because they aren't supported. They have no infantry support, they have minimized infantry support, or they have horrendous employment of their in the battle space of their forces, and they come up lacking in a lot of areas. And that's not to mention their equipment either. Their equipment's antiquated. When it comes to Russian vehicles, their equipment's very antiquated. The T-90 is supposed to have something called the Arena CAS, or the Arena Close and Air Defense System, that is meant to destroy incoming projectiles. Those haven't worked at all. We haven't seen a single instance in the entire war where the T-90 system is actually employing its Arena CAS. And that means that there is no defense, that they aren't equipped with even their intended defenses against anti-tank guided missiles. They don't even have what they're supposed to have. They can't even employ to the fullest that they're meant to be employed. And if you look at Russian doctrines, that you're seeing online, their forces are already meant to have been outfitted with the T-14 Armada, which is so unreliable that Russia hasn't even deployed it to Ukraine because they don't even trust it. So that is the reality of the warfare. And yes, the BGM TOW2, this is a TOW2 Bravo, by the way. This is not a TOW2 Bravo arrow. Whoever put that down is incorrect. But is a TOW2 Bravo, has the same shoot down flyover effect. The arrow has other stuff in it that I don't think I can disclose. So I hope that answers questions, and I hope that if Richard Garriott also sees this at some point, that Richard Garriott can see this section, even if he doesn't watch the rest, he can see this section and have a better understanding. And if anyone ever has questions about anti-armor warfare, as long as I am able to disclose something that isn't classified or isn't secret or something, I am more than happy to answer it as a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armor doctrine. But as always, do your own research and don't listen to people like Elon Musk on the internet talk about things that he has no reason to have any input on because he doesn't know what he's talking about. There's a reason why the war has developed the way it has. It's not because of the main battle tank being outdated. It's because of a number of other factors. All of them turn into one big problem. And just like World War I, just like every other war fought, there will become a time where they will have to overcome it. They will have to develop. They will have to strategize. And the next big thing, just like main battle tanks were part of the big reason to break the stalemate, the next big thing will come along as well. And that is how development, unfortunately, works, especially in a war zone. So with that, we move on to an actual thing now that my rant is over, and we go on to kind of the lighthearted thing of the night, which is kind of cool. Jump over here into Nebraska, where a rare quasi-crystal was found in a chunk of fossilized lightning. A tube of fossilized lightning from Nebraska's sandhills holds a rare type of quasi-crystal that had previously only been found in meteorites and in atomic bomb test sites. Quasi-crystals are materials that break the traditional rules of crystallography. Before they were first reported in 1984, scientists thought materials could either be crystalline with symmetrical repeating patterns or amorphous, meaning randomly arranged and disordered. Quasi-crystals break those rules. They are put together in an ordered pattern, but that pattern does not repeat. So that is what they're talking about. So there is a pattern, but it doesn't repeat. Kind of cool. If you want more from that, you can check out Live Science. It's called a fulgurite quasi-crystal. Max has a final question coming in regarding that. Can an anti-tank unit operate alone, or does it have to be combined with other units always? I don't think there's any way you can ever say an anti-tank unit will operate entirely alone. So in the Marine Corps, before we got rid of tanks, tanks had an entire section called a tow platoon. Similar to what I did, I was part of a CAT team, which stands for a Combined Anti-Armor Team, which means it's machine gunners and anti-tank missilemen put together, and we roll around in vehicles because the Sabre system, which is what shoots the tow missiles, the M41A7 Sabre, is a very, very heavy thing. But it has much longer range than the Javelin does, and so you get a better chance of hitting a tank before the tank can hit you. Sometimes the missiles actually outrange the main tank gun of the tank, but that's still a part of tanks. That tow platoon is still a part of tanks. The tow launchers on the tow launchers on the LAV, those are part of an LAV platoon. The Bradleys are cavalry scouts for a tank platoon. They're attached to tanks. They're attached to an armored platoon, an armored company or battalion. And same thing with pretty much anything else. Javelin teams are attached to infantry platoons and companies and battalions and stuff. Like, we're cast out. It's a battalion level asset. So yes and no. Because while you are usually by doctrine attached to some other unit, you can get mission sets that do force you to operate outside of the usual breakdown of command. And that is, it's called the Hunter-Killer Doctrine. It's not one that has very widely been employed, but what you basically do is you take, and this is something that I helped work on during my time in the Marine Corps, is there was a doctrine for CAT, or there was no doctrine for CAT, and we developed one where CAT platoons could operate in two categories. One is CAT Heavy, which is, we stayed the same with CAT Heavy, running MAPVs and MRAPs and Humvees, and then CAT Light. And CAT Light takes Hunter-Killer Doctrine, which used to be you take a squad of guys, a Javelin anti-tank team, and a bunch of saws and a couple of riflemen to help you carry anti-tank missiles, and you go it alone in a squad and you engage and hunt down behind, really ahead of enemy lines, and harass enemy tanks that are in transit and resupply convoys, and as they're coiled up and in their ready positions, you just harass the enemy, but you don't want to get decisively engaged, which, as a bunch of guys on foot, very hard to do, especially when you're talking about killing tanks and there's an entire battalion of them and 12 of you. Not exactly great odds if you become decisively engaged, even though you try not to. So we developed a CAT Light Doctrine, which takes the little Polaris Range Rovers and the little off-roads ones that the military uses, and you take Javelin teams and you mount up on those with a bunch of 240s and 249s, and you become a motorized hunter-killer team. You operate and conduct harassing fires and stuff like that, and you can set up in different positions for that. And then I also worked on employing something else I worked on when I went to Saudi Arabia. Not only did we go down there to train Saudi Arabian Marines, but I tested as the Javelin team lead for employing a Javelin team with a sniper and with snipers in a sniper hide to provide anti-armor capability, additional security, and additional observation benefits to a sniper platoon or its sniper team while they are in their hide position. So yes and no. You can go it alone. You can do independent things. You can be your own. You can have an OFP, but generally speaking, it's a very small job in a bigger picture of things, even if it plays a big part, especially as we see on the modern battlefield. So yes and no at the same time. You can operate alone, but it's part of a bigger picture, and you're probably going to have support of other assets just because of how vulnerable anti-tank teams are, considering what their target is. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope that all of you guys have a fantastic rest of your night and a wonderful day. So that actually wraps up all of the news for the night, guys, and I hope that you found this informative, and I hope that you guys I was able to answer a bunch of your questions and stuff. Please feel free to always ask questions. I will always try and answer them. But more than anything, I hope that you and your family and your friends remain safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. We will be back once again on Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central for another 48 hours of news and review. And in the meantime, I hope that you guys will check out the video description and give a bunch of love to those wonderful organizations down there below. And with that, my name is Paul from the New News, and have a fantastic rest of your night, and have a fantastic Tuesday and Wednesday, everybody. Alrighty, bye now.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлейфуємо. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям с кирпичом, даже танки и бочок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your top 11, shove it up your wrinkled bum. Oh, we'll come to help you fit it in your skull.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волноваги, чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Ідіть нахуй.